My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
The COVID-19 response, diversity, equity, and inclusion at the State Department, and complex policy issues in the world's most volatile places. These are just some of the issues that cross the desk of the Deputy Secretary of State each week. To understand what the Deputy, known as D in the State Department, does on a daily basis, I spoke to Steve Biegun. He served as the 20th Deputy Secretary of State from December 2019 until January 2021, and was also the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, a job he held from 2018 until the end of the Trump administration. Welcome to Diplomatic Immunity. My name is Kelly McFarland, Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. A few weeks ago, for the last episode of this season of the podcast, I had the chance to speak to Deputy Secretary Biegun. I wanted to understand what this under-recognized position does day to day, but also the unique nature of the role in the Trump administration under Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Steve Biegun's concurrent role working on North Korea issues and his leadership of the State Department's early response to COVID and efforts to bring American citizens, known as AMCITs, home as countries shuttered their borders in an effort to get the outbreak under control. We also spoke about polarization in American politics and responses to the death of George Floyd, both in the State Department and around the world. You'll hear his recollections on coping with these policy areas and what might be viewed as controversial statements on domestic political polarization during the Trump administration. I'm also joined today by Ahmed, himself a Foreign Service officer and Rusk Fellow at our institute. Ahmed worked for Deputy Secretary Biegun as a special assistant before coming to Georgetown. He invited Steve Biegun to speak to the undergraduate class he taught last semester, and so I wanted to catch up with him to see what insights Biegun had to share, as well as what it was like being a special assistant in Dee's office.
Working in the Deputy Secretary's office was a great experience, as I was able to get a bird's eye view of the foreign policy challenges facing the United States and the hard work that goes into shaping our approaches to these issues. Deputy Secretary Biegun joined my Diplomacy in Action course a few weeks ago, as you mentioned, and shared career advice with my undergraduate students, many of whom were soon to be graduating and beginning their careers. The biggest piece of advice that stood out amongst the students, I think, was the importance of being open to new experiences and new opportunities as they come up, and not think you must have a plan for each of the next 10 years. He also shared some insights from his time as number 2 in the department, some insights I think we'll hear on today's episode.
Thanks, Ahmed. Let's listen to the conversation with Steve Biegun. All right, Steve Biegun, welcome to the Diplomatic Immunity Podcast. We're happy to have you, and thanks for coming on board.
Thank you, Kelly. Glad to be here with you today.
So our first question today gets into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the State Department and how it works. And you served as the Deputy Secretary of State, which is the number 2 position at the department. For those listeners that might not be as familiar with how the State Department works, can you walk us through a little bit what the role of the number 2 in the department usually plays and what your role was in that position? Maybe a little bit of what your day-to-day was like, as much as there was a quote day-to-day in today's fast-moving world.
Yeah, happy to. Every cabinet agency has a deputy. And I think there are certain responsibilities that the deputy secretary will have that are in common across almost every agency, from the national security agencies like State Department and Defense Department to the domestic agencies like Health and Human Services or Department of Commerce. The deputy plays in each of these cases a fairly similar role. One of the first things you learn as deputy, incidentally, is that the position defies the laws of physics. Rocks can roll uphill and downhill at the same time, and that is, in essence, the responsibility of the deputy. Issues, challenges, assignments coming down from the secretary, from the president through the cabinet to the secretary to the deputy, they have to be followed up inside the building, and also a lot of the challenges and decision making, for that matter, just routine decision making inside the department comes up to the deputy. It's too much for the secretary to be able to handle all of it. In virtually any department of government, the deputy's job is going to have certain elements. One is you are basically in charge of running the building. Secretaries are presumed to be the principals to the president. They're traveling a lot. They're the face of the administration. They oftentimes have to change their schedules at short notice because the president has a priority that the president wants addressed, and the secretary has to go off and do it. And in the rest of the world, when real challenges are manifesting themselves, whether it's a domestic issue that's being fought out on Capitol Hill or a overseas crisis, that there's a certain cachet that comes with the cabinet secretary, with the secretary of state or whoever the other secretary is, that draws them. And the deputy is really the at-home presence largely. And so, for example, in our department, I never traveled when the secretary was traveling. Well, with maybe one or two exceptions where it was absolutely essential, but we tried to deconflict it. And the secretary traveled far more than the deputy did because of the ministerial responsibilities. So the first responsibility I'd say across any department is you are running the building. Second part of it is that you are at the key coordinating level across the government. So I think most of your viewers will know that the national security bureaucracies are organized under the National Security Council, and they have layers of consultative process from a lower level of policy coordination to the deputies, which is where I would sit, to the principals, which would be the cabinet secretaries, to the actual National Security Council, which is established in law, and that's chaired by the president. And that's rare that decisions get to that level and still have wide ranges of options. The process is supposed to narrow these decisions progressively for the president, but that policy alignment is an all-consuming responsibility for deputies. At least one day a week, sometimes 2 days a week. I think early in an administration like the Biden administration right now, several days a week, deputies are spending hours together in the Situation Room, or with pandemic restrictions, they're doing it by secure video. Especially at the beginning of administration, you're trying to get aligned on all the policy decisions. You're starting to see that. Just recently, the Biden administration made a series of announcements about U.S.-Russia relations, for example. And that came out in a way that suggested to me that it was very closely coordinated in an interagency process. The third responsibility that the deputy secretary has is execution. And this is critically important. This is where a lot of foreign policy fails. It's not on the conception, but on the execution. The ability to drive a sprawling government with huge organizations and a worldwide set of interests to execute is challenging on any given day. But when you're dealing with an issue like, for us, the magnitude of the China issue, which touched every dimension of the department's work, every dimension of the U.S. government's work, every dimension of our lives, because of the size of China, because of the magnitude of the challenges. Executing on that it requires senior leadership, and so execution, I think, is one of the underappreciated responsibilities of deputies, and it can be in competition with the other things, because if you're constantly down at the White House doing interagency meetings, you don't have the opportunity to drive your own building and execute your own priorities. So execution is another one. Those are the elements that, Kelly, I would say are common across all deputies, regardless of the department or agency. But there are some that are unique to state too. The deputy is the surge capacity in the building. So if the secretary is consumed with a crisis in one part of the world, for example, Secretary Pompeo, I believe, was in Ukraine when the pandemic really burst out into into the consciousness of the world in January of last year. And the secretary was traveling. I had to start attending meetings that just became essentially my responsibility, which were, I was down at the White House several hours a day for weeks, months even. And the secretary couldn't do that and still be the Secretary of State of the United States of America. So that's the surge capacity role of the deputy. And I could name any number of other places where, we had the two things happening at once, and somebody had to be at point on each one. The deputy also at state has ministerial responsibilities. I would receive a lot of ambassadors. I'd receive a lot of foreign government officials. And when the secretary wasn't in town and he had a foreign counterpart coming, I'd receive his counterparts, which was fairly common. And I'd travel. As I said, I deconflicted. Deputies need to deconflict with the secretary so they don't travel at the same time. But I did travel even during the pandemic. There were some missions that needed to be done in person, very sensitive messages passed to partner governments, and required my presence. Those are the elements that are more unique to the State Department, and then there's the things that I did. I took a real responsibility for Congressional Relations. Because of my background, I spent more of my career in the congressional branch than anywhere else. I've placed a high value in those relations and understood their importance for making the department more effective. I engaged with a lot of foreign governments and allies at my level, incidentally, and we created a great kind of set of sinews between allies and friends and partners during COVID-19 by doing coordinating meetings virtually, mostly phone calls, with groups of allies from around the world. Allies and partners really did a great job behind the scenes, keeping our relationships intact. I also invested in engaging in outside stakeholders, non-governmental organizations, interest groups, which again are all American citizens have a right to hear their voice, have their voice heard, and we really put a lot of effort into paying attention to outside views as well, and oftentimes would come across some good ideas while we were at it. So those are, and the last thing I did is, because I had that responsibility I mentioned that all deputies do, that you kind of run the building, I actually made a point of getting to every single bureau in the department. And I'm really proud during the slightly over a year that I was deputy, I was able to sit down. In the last half of my tenure, it was virtual meetings because of the pandemic, but I was able to sit down with every single bureau or bureau equivalent organization in the department, about 3 dozen, and hear their priorities, share my priorities, and in doing so, I've really felt like I could make a stronger connection to the building that pays benefits in any number of ways, including on execution of policy, which is so important. So those are how I would describe the deputy's job, Kelly. And of course, you have an enormous resource to draw upon in the department. You have talented men and women who are working on these issues day and night and know them inside out. But at the end of the day, it's the deputy who has to sit at that table. And so you have to be able to draw on that resource. I had tremendous support. I have no complaints about the support I got, but time is your finite. Time is the limit. And, time comes at a cost too. You can stay at the office until late into the evening, but the stamina it takes to do these jobs. I was in the National Security Council in the White House when I was 38. I was in 37. I was in the State Department when I was 57. I got to tell you, there's a big difference between being a 57-year-old and a 37-year-old in these kind of jobs. But they're important jobs. It's service to the country. It's not for everybody, but it's a great privilege to serve in that role. But you find yourself at a certain point just craving sleep. I wasn't averse to asking my chief of staff to kind of guard the door for half an hour in the middle of the day, just because you needed it. She told me there was a sign down in the cafeteria, I think it was gone by the time I came, that said, the only replacement for sleep is sleep. And she said that always rang true with her, because you could drink your 5-hour energy drink, or you could get another cup of coffee, or you could, whatever you would do, or you can just tough it out while you're exhausted. But there's no replacement for sleep. And in these jobs, you do find yourself craving sleep. I slept for probably almost 3 or 4 weeks. That was the number one thing I did after I left the job: sleep.
Yeah, that sounds like it was needed. I remember when I was doing the PDB briefing for Secretary Kerry that I was always amazed that, I'd have his schedule and he'd land at Andrews at like 4 a.m. and then he'd be sitting at the desk at 7:45 when I was there to brief him. And it's just, having the energy to do that, but also to deal with not only the breadth of issues, but then the the depth that you need to know on these issues as well is just, it's pretty amazing. And it's a testament to the folks that are at that level and, pushing forward on even without sleep.
I give credit where credit's due. The briefers, like the role you played in the foreign service and civil service experts, you're set up to succeed. You're not set up to fail. But time is the essential constraint. You're asking about an average day. So, my day started every day at 7:30 a.m. With a one-on-one with the secretary or a small group of senior leaders with the secretary every day of the week, 5 days a week. And by 9 a.m., which was a kind of a more civilized working hour in the world, I could be on my fourth meeting easily on any given day, at 4 meetings into the day at 9 in the morning. Invariably, because everybody's working on the same cadence, the paperwork would start coming in the late afternoon because other parts of the department were working on recommendations or policy decisions. This is a big job of the deputy too that I didn't touch on, but the secretary makes the decisions, but in the execution, there's a lot of paperwork to review. It would not be uncommon for me to have five inches or more of documents and supporting material to review in the mid to late afternoon. Oftentimes, we demanded that it be several days in advance. I think our requirement was 5 days in advance, but invariably something would come up where, okay, we didn't give you 5 days, but it's still got to be decided tomorrow, and you just have to do it. You'd have to read it and get through it and make a decision. And fortunately, a lot because of the processes in the State Department, which I won't go into detail here, but there's a process in the department to make sure materials are prepared properly. There's this legendary organization called the Line in the State Department where they really do make sure that you're getting synced, crisp recommendations, necessary supporting information. So again, as I said, you're set up to succeed, not to fail, but it's still a lot. 5 inches of paper at 5 p.m. on a Friday doesn't bring joy to anybody. And my chief of staff, she referred to it as the witching hour. At about 5 o'clock on a Friday, everybody's outboxes would get emptied and the deputy's inbox would fill up. Still, those are observations about the job, not complaints. It was an incredible honor to be the deputy secretary and an incredible responsibility to be the person who had to finally make the call on some very important decisions like that. Sometimes I'd make the call on my own. Sometimes I'd say, no, this one needs to go to the secretary. Sometimes I'd go to the secretary and say, Mr. Secretary, I think this one needs to go to the president. But that's what we did.
Yeah, it always amazed me just the amount of paper that was put in front of the principals on a daily basis. The document I would bring every morning was, depending on the day, anywhere from 40 to 80 pages. And that was I'm just one person amidst hundreds that are sending stuff up to the 7th floor. So
that was my second meeting of the day, Kelly.
Yep.
Reading always. That, and it's still 40 to 80 pages.
Always a depressing way to start your day.
Yeah, but also, you feel responsibility because you may be one of a handful of people reading some of that information, and so you can't phone it in. You have got to look at it, and you've got to say, in our careers, all of our careers, there's always someone above us. We'll make a recommendation to them or whatever. But at a certain point, when you're deputy or secretary, sometimes you are the top. And so you can't just kind of say, okay, well, gee, that's really alarming, but someone else will figure out what to do about it. You also have to figure out what to do about it. And that, when you climb the ladder of your career, it's hard to psychologically realize when you're making that leap from staffer to principal. But obviously, being the deputy secretary of a department of government is that leap. And you've got to read stuff and you've got to get on the phone and say, hey, we got to do something about this or that or this or that. So that 40 to 80 pages of overnight intelligence is both a blessing and a curse, because with it came an enormous responsibility.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned the COVID response and sort of how you were thrust into that when it started to break in January. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and your position as sort of the state's COVID-19 response and the efforts to bring home American citizens. And also, you mentioned sort of the interagency process and like the execution aspect of foreign policy making. And there were a couple articles I'm sure you saw about some infighting going on about getting people back and stuff. So if you could kind of talk about how that demonstrates sort of the difficulty sometimes with working with a handful of agencies to coordinate policies and to ultimately get folks home and how that process went.
State Department had a huge role in the pandemic response early on in the first months of it, going through, I'd say, from January until about June. Initially, those responsibilities, even in the month of January, involved making or contributing to judgments and decisions about travel restrictions, whether to stop travelers from coming in from China, in particular, what level of warning to give American citizens about traveling abroad, considering the fast-moving nature of the pandemic. It also included a real concerted effort to get the Chinese government to cooperate in helping us gain better understanding of the behavior of the virus, which was a novel virus, and it still has attributes that I think are understudied by our scientists and medical experts, that things that we still don't know about the duration of immunities or things like that it just over time we're going to know. But it's hard to turn back the clock to what we didn't know in January, but we didn't know if it was transmissible in a human to human form initially. We didn't know how it was transmitting to people. We didn't know the mortality rate. We didn't know how infectious it was, and we learned in many ways. We learned the hard way those. But in that environment, we were working very hard to try to get to get experts into China to get to ground zero, and it was very difficult. And we did that in part through political engagement. We did it in part through offering taking a benign approach towards China. So we evacuated U.S. citizens from Wuhan early in the pandemic in late January, early February, and we loaded the 747s with privately donated humanitarian assistance for the overwhelmed hospital systems in Wuhan in order to provide some relief, but also as a gesture of goodwill in hopes that the Chinese would reciprocate by taking a more engaged and open approach to the pandemic. And unfortunately, they didn't. And I think that came at a grave cost to the entire world when they chose instead. China viewed it less as a threat to public health and more as a threat to the legitimacy of the Communist Party in China. And so they didn't do what they should have. And I think history will bear that out. But we got very quickly into the business of repatriating Americans, which is something that State Department had done occasionally in small numbers over recent history, but never anything of this magnitude. And the controversy you're reading about from this recent, I think it's Inspector General report at HHS, it involves kind of how the domestic agencies, CDC, HHS, were making decisions on protecting the American public, and while at the same time setting constraints on returning visitors. That it was a domestic medical dispute. Our State Department was bringing people from overseas to the United States, and we were chartering the aircraft. We worked very closely with the Department of Defense to bring them to military bases and execute 14-day quarantines. We executed those 14-day quarantines without fail. CDC and HHS performed admirably. The criticisms that I read struck me as more hypothetical, that in theory, it could have been more useful, for example, if CDC had put a mandatory quarantine order in place that would have required people for 14 days to stay in the facility. But everybody did stay in facilities for 14 days. There was, as the report says, one individual who tried to stray off, but we had federal marshals at the sites to keep them there, and ultimately the authorities were put in place. So I don't see that. I would change nothing. Let me say that, based upon what I read in those reviews. And I will tell you that for the Department of State, in my 30 years or so involved in international affairs, this was one of their finest moments. 100,000 American citizens who were literally trapped overseas as rapidly closing travel and border controls left people marooned all over the world. Students who were on a 1-week trekking trip to Machu Picchu and were living on the proverbial $5 or $10 a day, found that they couldn't leave, had no money, had no place to stay, had no recourse. Business travelers, people visiting family, even expatriates who had moved overseas but quickly wanted to return back to the safety of the United States of America in a time of crisis like this. All told, as I think you know, Kelly, we had 100,000 American citizens, more than 100,000, who were repatriated through charter aircraft. One of the really creative things the department did was worked with the commercial airlines who had shut down their routes, but got them to open up the routes that they served in certain areas to bring Americans home. Americans could literally go on their website and book the flights. That way, State Department didn't have to manage that. Although in many cases, our Foreign Service officers and civil servants were at the airports, abandoned airports, lights out, helping people carry their luggage through the airport, checking them in for the flight, making sure their bags were getting on the plane, and sending them home. And they did this over the course of weeks. Over 100,000 American citizens who came home. And it wasn't a muscle memory that the State Department had. I think most of us, myself especially, when we go into a career in foreign policy, citizen services and consular services is not on the front of mind. We want to negotiate ends to wars or big treaties or new alliances or resolve humanitarian crises. Service to the American people isn't necessarily the first, at least service in terms of that kind of service isn't front of mind. And it took a little while, I'll tell you, for the State Department to get its sea legs, but through some tremendous leadership. We sent a senior Foreign Service officer down to South America, and she just created the template for how we were going to get Americans home at this time. The weekend before she did that, I was on the phone with 21 U.S. senators over the course of the weekend, another joyful part of the deputy's job, getting screamed at about students that couldn't get home, about parents who were worried about their kids, about spouses who were divided between two continents, and what could we do? And why weren't we doing more to get them? State Department didn't have an air force. We didn't have, but we figured it out, and we figured it out, and it wasn't without its kinks. And HHS and CDC's processes for managing those folks when they came back in the initial stages might generate some hindsight reviews, but I will tell you that I would do nothing differently. And the courage and the performance, particularly of our consular affairs section, but many, many other parts of the department, people volunteered for these duties. It really, as I said, I think it was one of the State Department's finest moments.
The notion of this sort of action by the State Department is sort of an undervalued, overlooked aspect of what the State Department does, but becomes so important when it's needed. And the ability for, the Foreign Service professionals and civil service professionals at the State Department to step up and get the job done and do it in a admirable fashion, I think speaks to the ingenuity and dedication of those folks.
There's another important part of the backbone of the department that neither you nor I have mentioned, which is our locally employed staff or Foreign Service nationals. As some of your listeners may know, a lot of the essential functions in the embassies are actually performed by people from the country in which the embassy is located. And in some cases, these people have worked with us for decades. Legendary figures who have seen U.S. ambassadors come and go, but who know everything about the lay of the land and are incredibly valuable day to day to the functioning of the embassies. But in a crisis like this, invaluable. And it was my great pleasure to be able to recognize and award a number of our locally employed staff, non-American citizens, who devoted themselves at great risk as well. And more than great risk, in the great unknown, because in these dark early days of the pandemic, even as bad as it was, we didn't know how bad it was.
COVID, obviously, in both domestically and internationally, has become quite politicized over the course of the last year. And in many ways, and for a number of reasons, state and U.S. foreign policy writ large became even more politicized while you were at state and over the past 4 years. as the Secretary Pompeo was vocal on a number of domestic political issues as well as international ones. Can you talk a little bit about how that affected things from your perspective on the foreign policy front?
Yeah, well, larger than any individuals, we are at a very polarized moment. I don't think that comes as a news flash to you or anybody else. And it can be incredibly challenging to execute sound policy in that environment. The politicization of the COVID-19 ip it was so strange to me that partisan battle lines began being drawn about to wear a mask or not wear a mask, to keep a business open or to close a business open, to open a school or close a school. And everybody had their facts that they could cite, and they'll probably argue these things for the rest of time. But it didn't help having these choices fall into political lanes instead of being data and science driven. And so it made it very challenging. And you found people's positions, there's not a lot of consistency as you look across the year plus of this pandemic either. People were against masks before they were for them. People, wanted the vaccines to move at warp speed, but then are reluctant to take them. No political side has a great consistency here, but it didn't help in the successful execution of policy. And the numbers speak for themselves. 30 plus million Americans ultimately were infected by this virus, and 500,000 plus have perished as a consequence of this virus. And that's not in anybody's book. That's not a definition of success. And that was driven in part by, I think, political division. And I don't blame any one party. I think there's plenty of blame to go around to all parties on that one. But on the larger execution of foreign policy and the role of politics and policy, I've been involved in international affairs for more than 3 decades. But my entire participation in foreign relations, except for when I was essentially doing it in the private sector, was because in the corporate sector, I also did international affairs on behalf of an iconic American company, helping sort out global risk and strategy and work with foreign governments on investment proposals and so on. But at least in my government capacity, I've always been at the intersection of politics and foreign policy. Actually, maybe a little bit outside the norm or the conventional wisdom. So I think that's very important because I think politics is the glue that connects policy to the American public. And so I don't want to see partisanship in foreign policy. Our politics are the essence of our democracy. We don't want in a class of apolitical experts alone to be the drivers of our foreign policy. We are a democratic system. We don't operate effectively if we're not connecting with our publics. And so politics is always going to be some dimension of this. And there's nothing about this last 4 years. Again, I make myself sound old, but in my 34 years, I've seen politics intrude into foreign policy plenty. And I've seen, as much as I like Arthur Vandenberg's admonition to leave our differences at the water's edge. The truth is American foreign policy has been the world's concern. And it's been a subject debated around the world for most of our post-World War II history. But there are limits. First of all, there's statutory limits. There's a law called the Hatch Act, which requires all of us, even political appointees once become into public service, to not advocate a partisan advantage. But the Hatch Act, for its simplicity of purpose, has a lot of shaded areas. What is a speech advocating policy versus a political endorsement for the agenda of the sitting president? I think secretaries of state have had to grapple with that across time and have made their own judgments about that. I think it's very important particularly for the career public servants, to try to hew to a nonpartisan, to aspire to a nonpartisan set of responsibilities, not to be politicized themselves. And it's hard because, our career officers are human beings. They vote. They're equally citizens of our democracy, and to kind of set that aside and come into the job is a challenge. I'm sure. I tried to play a role of calming those passions, and sometimes I had to play the role of policing them inside the department too, because both political appointees and career officials would occasionally stray out of that area. But each of us has to find our own norm there. I would reject the notion, though, that foreign policy should be completely devoid of politics. If it was, I think we would risk losing the support of the American people.
So moving on to a much easier question than domestic and external political partisanship, North Korea. Prior to becoming the deputy, you were the special representative for North Korea, and you remained in that role while you became the number 2. Could you talk a little bit about why the North Korean issue is such a difficult one, and what do you believe the Biden administration can or should do in the early months of their administration towards North Korea?
Yeah, so it was actually the North Korea issue that attracted me into the government. I was perfectly happy more than a decade and a half in the private sector as a senior executive at a U.S. company, and I loved my job. And when Republicans took back the White House as a Republican foreign policy professional, it certainly piqued my interest. It looked like a pretty hard job to me for a lot of reasons that were I think clear to most. And so I was a little bit slow on the uptake to decide whether or not I wanted to serve again. But when I was asked by the Secretary of State to do the North Korea job, it really piqued my interest. First of all, nobody would have ever had me on the list of the top 1,000 experts on North Korea in Washington, D.C. I actually think that advantaged me because I was able to come and take a fresh look at this. And by the way, I was attracted to it too because the president was a complicated individual for sure, and very different than I think virtually any president we've had over recent decades. But one of the things that could be both maddening and attractive was his willingness to think well outside of the conventions. And so in the case of North Korea, we have been in the same rut for 65 years. We've been in the same rut since the end of the Korean War. And nothing is changing. And so the president came at this initially in his term quite hard. Everyone will remember the period of fire fury. I remember it well because one of the things I was doing, the last thing I did in my corporate life was a risk assessment of what would happen if war broke out on the Korean Peninsula and how it disrupts the global economy and the operations of a major company, the supply chains throughout the Indo-Pacific. And so I was at least thinking about it and quite frankly worried about. And then things shifted with the leader level engagement. It was the first time we tried that. It was a novel approach. It was nothing that any other previous president probably would have had the political will or political courage to do because of the potential for criticism. But we tried it. In trying it, we tested what North Koreans had told generations of U.S. negotiators in the past, which is anything is possible if the two leaders can reach agreement. And we tested that proposition. We tested it thoroughly. But the truth is, Kelly, it didn't work. And while I can take satisfaction in the fact that we were able to avoid severe provocations over a 2.5-year period, we didn't see any ICBM tests. We didn't see any nuclear weapons tests. We also didn't. We were unable to halt the nuclear and missile programs of the North Koreans. Now we certainly slowed them, and we certainly affected them because we also had a rigorous set of sanctions in place that deprived the North Koreans of technology and materials they needed. But we didn't stop them, and they were able to continue at great sacrifice by their own people to continue to make advances in this area. I fundamentally, and I've said this in other fora, fundamentally, I think that the challenge is that the leader of North Korea, Chairman Kim Jong-un, simply hasn't made his decision that this is the course he wants to take. And there is a path to a brighter future open to North Korea, one that will lower tensions on the Korean Peninsula, create a better life for all the people of the Korean Peninsula, but especially the people of North Korea. But it will require North Korea also to abandon its weapons of mass destruction program. But in the process, you can build a greater sense of security for the North Koreans on the Korean Peninsula that eliminates whatever perception drives them to think they need those nuclear weapons. We're prepared to do that. The previous administration was prepared to engage in that process, and we looked at any number of creative ways to sequence this, to move in parallel on different tracks in order to achieve this. But it was clear to us at a certain point that the North Koreans simply hadn't made the decision that that's where they wanted to go. And the reason is quite simple, is that at the center of the hierarchy of interests for the North Korean regime is regime survival itself. The survival of a dictatorial dynasty in the Kim family. That is job one, from job one to job 100. At the same time, separately, in parallel, I think the leadership in North Korea recognizes that they're a horribly impoverished country, that their population suffers not just economic deprivation, but healthcare issues, things as rudimentary as clean drinking water. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, at least for the population outside elite circles. And I think the leadership truly does recognize, and perhaps is even a little bit humbled or embarrassed by the fact that their people live in such deplorable conditions and such hardship. And so you've got these two competing goals that the leadership in North Korea wants to preserve the dynasty, the dictatorship, but they also want to advance the economy. And the problem is that to make progress on the economic agenda imperils the political agenda. To achieve the political agenda imperils the economic agenda. They've never been able to reconcile that. And when they are, I think President Biden, as much as President Trump, is prepared to start walking down that path with the North Koreans. But it's a decision they have to make. The one that we will not make is that we will address their economic priorities and ignore the political and military realities on the peninsula. That won't happen.
How important is China in this?
China is hugely important, and China was a big part of my work early on. I traveled to China any number of times, and actually had a very good relationship with my Chinese counterparts over the course of the 2.5 years, even through as deputy. North Korea was an issue where there was at least a certain level of agreement between the United States and China. The United States and China, up to a point, agreed. We might have wanted to go further in some respects. We place a much higher value on human rights and also on the protection of the individual rights in North Korean society, on the nature of its government, things that are of less interest or concern to the Chinese. But the Chinese recognize the destabilizing and provocative nature of North Korea armed with weapons of mass destruction. I mean, one of the things that I talked about with my Chinese counterparts is don't for a moment think that North Korea will be the last nuclear weapons state in East Asia if they essentially become a de facto nuclear weapons state. The North Koreans will only be the latest. How can future generations of Japanese or South Korean or Vietnamese or even Taiwanese leaders be persuaded that they don't need to independently have a nuclear weapons capability when North Korea poses a direct threat to them? In some cases, South Korea and Japan, they have the extended deterrent of the United States of America to deter that nuclear attack. Under the extended deterrent, we would respond to a nuclear weapons attack against Japan in like. But the challenge is that these alliances have to stand the test of time too. At a certain point, if you're sitting in Tokyo, are you satisfied that the American president will risk the American homeland to defend Japan from a nuclear weapon attack? And that's when the kernel of thought starts to occur in the minds of a policymaker. Perhaps we need our own independent nuclear weapons deterrent. I think that's a world we're headed toward if we can't get our arms around North Korea's nuclear weapons program. By the way, that's what the Middle East is going to look like if we don't divert Iran's efforts to develop a nuclear weapon and end them, not just slow them, but I mean end them. So China's hugely important. China shares the same concerns we do about instability on the Korean Peninsula. China doesn't want North Korea to be a nuclear weapon state. They might move at a different pace. They might have a different formula for how they get there. And ultimately, I think what the Chinese prize above all is stability. But at least in 2017 and 2018, they came to the conclusion that stability was impossible, incompatible with the North Korean nuclear weapons program. But like everything, it's also affected by the tenor of the overall relationship. And so I certainly felt a diminished cooperation with my counterparts in China over the course of 2020 and into 2021. And I think that considering the challenging state of U.S.-China relations right now, it's going to be hard for us to do what both sides say they want to do, is look at areas of mutual interest and cooperate on them. It appears that this might at least be in the initial stages of happening on climate change, from at least what I read in the press reports. It would be great if we could put together at least an aligned approach on North Korea. But just as I said, up to a certain point, our interests agree, but beyond that point, they don't.
Last question, and we'll get you out of here on this one. So another thing you oversaw at the department was the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. What did your work on this entail? What were you guys able to accomplish? And what about the State Department? What still needs to be done to enhance diversity and inclusion at the department?
Yeah, this was an issue that was near and dear to me. And I should start by saying that I put a lot of time into it. And I gave the patina of senior leadership. But just like on every other issue I worked on, there was an enormous reservoir of talented individuals working day to day on this. Our Undersecretary for Management, Brian Bulatow, was a real champion on these issues, and he was in our administration the lead person for running the management of the building. And likewise, our Director General of the Foreign Service, our head of Global Talent Management, Carol Perez, was just a real champion on this. So I had plenty of company. The catalyst, of course, was the killing of George Floyd. And that really was a turning point, I think, for all of American society, but the department as well. And the department has struggled with diversity issues and inclusion issues across its existence. Women, roles of women, spouses, married couples, even, there were days when pregnancy could be a fatal error for a young female foreign service officer, just things that we would find today to be just completely unacceptable. But the department has had to struggle and work its way through this, and not entirely with success. And the data speaks for itself. We just don't have data that suggests that through the course of the arc of somebody's career, we're maintaining a diverse workforce. We're doing really well, I think, at the entry level. The attraction of a career in the Foreign Service or the Civil Service is still, has a sense of adventure and excitement that draws young people from across the country, and we can address that part of the challenge pretty easily by making sure we get out to some non-traditional universities and places where we recruit or advertise for people to come in the department. We've set up a variety of ways to get into the department, all that are extraordinarily rigorous, but that allow us to bring in a more diverse workforce. But we're losing a lot of people about the middle of their career. In some cases, that's affecting our diversity and inclusion. It's also affecting the quality of our workforce, and we're losing good people. And some of these challenges are tied together. Some of them are unique to diversity. One of the things I championed, Kelly, was a course that is offered at the Foreign Service Institute, where we train our foreign service officers on recognizing unconscious bias. Times of social change have huge political tensions, not just. It's not just an engineering exercise and a data exercise. When you're challenging accepted norms in a society, or trying to change a society or improve a society, it's going to face resistance. There's going to be disputatious. You're even going to see violence on the streets as we have. It's not acceptable, but it's been seen before. But the hope is that you also can create a more just and democratic society. When you think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and what was polarizing and controversial then now is seen as an iconic and a commendable moment in American history. We look back at these civil rights leaders as heroes, people who at the time were vilified and attacked. One of the things that we really championed was unconscious bias. And unconscious bias, and for anybody who's with the State Department or outside who has the opportunity to learn about this, I would recommend you do, because it was very revelatory for me, looking at my own the way I think about things. And unconscious bias really comes down to one simple thing. It's two, I would say. One is take a moment, take a breath, think about who you're asking to do a job, who you're bringing into the team, who you're recommending for promotion, and don't go with just your gut instinct. Just don't go with your comfort zone. One of the things, racial or ethnic differences might get outside somebody's comfort zone. It's just, or people with different views will get out their comfort zone. But you've got to step back and look more holistically at your talent. And then you've got to select people and advance people based upon a very fair look at that. That's what unconscious bias is jumping to a conclusion immediately without having thought about all the considerations in advance. The other element of it is good leadership. And these are the two areas that I really focused on in the department was recognizing unconscious bias and getting good leadership. And so where I would see this in practical terms most often, Kelly, was not in, the way the State Department promotes and advances people is it develops pools of individuals. And then from that pool of individuals, somebody is selected. And it wasn't in the final selection, because when you look at the peers in a group, you'd say, well, on balance, that really is the best person. It was in the assembly of the pool of candidates where it was happening. And here, this defies the ability of the senior leadership. You can't get down and into this decision-making process at that level, but you can put it on the leaders in those organizations to do so. That they need to be the ones that make sure that the pools that they assemble have been thoughtfully considered, and that people, in some cases, because of the patterns of promotion in the department over the years, people will self-opt out of putting themselves forward. So you've got to go to them and say, no, listen, you have great potential. You are a serious candidate for this. You should put your name forward, or you should express an interest in that promotion. That's not to say that this is only a leadership issue. Of course, we deal with in the department, as we do across American society, with issues of racism and hostile work practices and so on. And we have mechanisms to deal with those too. We have an Office of Civil Rights. We have an EEOC office. We will enforce, and we should enforce against conscious bias, against racism. And there's no place in that. In the process, my hope as an American, my hope as an American foreign policy professional, is we put together this great, diverse, highly capable set of diplomats that give us untold advantages worldwide. We can connect with cultures. We understand other cultures. We have sympathetic connections. We have people who speak the languages, who know the histories, or at least have enough experience and diversity and experience that they, even if it's a place that's unknown to them, they recognize what it's like to be from a different group or outside what's considered to be the norm in any society. It allows us just huge advantages as a country, and it's the strength of our country. It is, at times like this, it can feel like a weakness. It can feel like we're tearing ourselves apart, and God knows, I've had my moments of just being depressed about some of the things I've seen. But I also think that if we get it right, we can look back on moments of social change like this with the same pride that we look back at the 1960s and the civil rights movement. Say, at the end of the day, we emerged from this as a more fair and more democratic society.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. That was great.
Well, thank you.
Steve,
thank
you
you.
very
I
much.
hope this is of some benefit to your listeners.
That was Diplomatic Immunity. Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever they listen. Follow us on Twitter at GU Diplomacy, and visit our website isd.georgetown.edu.